My name is Cora Hayes, and 3 months ago, I learned that the quietest actions can create the most profound changes. This story isn't about revenge, not in the way people usually think of it. It's about the subtle, inevitable balancing of scales, about learning the weight of one's own worth, and about the day my world broke open, only to be pieced back together into something stronger and more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. But before that day, there was Havenwood. I grew up in a small town nestled in a valley that smelled of damp earth and pine needles. My parents owned Hayes's Hardware, a place that was less a store and more the town's communal garage. It was where you went for a single bolt you couldn't find anywhere else, for advice on a leaky faucet, or just for a cup of my dad's perpetually brewing, slightly burnt coffee. I spent my childhood stocking shelves and my teenage years behind the counter, learning a truth that seemed as fundamental as gravity. Business wasn't about transactions, it was about relationships. We knew whose daughter was starting college, whose roof had survived the winter storm, and who needed a bit of extra time to pay their bill. My father used to say, "People don't come back for the hammers, Cora. They come back because they know we care if their picture frame hangs straight." That philosophy was woven into the fabric of my being. When I moved to the coastal city of Port Blossom, with its salty air and avenues lined with cherry trees that erupted in a riot of pink every spring, I carried Havenwood with me. I'd secured a position as a client relations specialist at Apex Solutions Group, a prestigious consulting firm whose sleek, glass and steel tower seemed to pierce the often overcast sky. The name itself, Apex, felt ambitious, a world away from the comfortable clutter of Hayes's Hardware. My supervisor was Miranda Croft. She was a woman who seemed to be carved from the same sharp, modern materials as our office building. Her posture was perfect, her suits were impeccably tailored, and her smile never quite reached her eyes. Miranda believed in a world governed by metrics, key performance indicators, and ruthless efficiency. To her, human emotion was an unpredictable variable, a messy bug in an otherwise clean system. She saw my role not as a builder of bridges, but as a processor of communications. "Your goal," she told me during my first week, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth, "is to minimize call duration while maximizing client compliance. Log the interaction, solve the problem, close the ticket." That's the Apex way. But as I delved into the client files, I found a desert. The communication logs were sterile, robotic. They recorded problems and solutions, but nothing of the people behind the accounts. These were businesses, artisan bakeries, family-owned vineyards, independent publishers, that poured their souls into their work, yet to Apex, they were just names on an invoice. A deep, quiet ache settled in my chest. This wasn't just inefficient, it felt disrespectful. So, I began my own quiet rebellion. I started to listen. My first real connection was with Mr. Laurent, the owner of a beloved local bakery called the Gilded Crust. His croissants were legendary in Port Blossom, flaky and buttery masterpieces. During a routine call about a billing error, he mentioned offhandedly that his daughter was anxiously awaiting a letter from her dream art school. His voice, usually so full of life when he talked about sourdough starters, was tight with a father's worry. I made a small, private note. A week later, I called him back, ostensibly to confirm the billing issue was resolved. Before hanging up, I asked, "Mr. Laurent, has there been any news from the art school?" The silence on the other end of the line was so complete I thought we'd been disconnected. Then, he let out a long, shaky breath. "She got in," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She got the acceptance letter yesterday. We were up all night celebrating." He was so touched that I had remembered, so grateful to have someone to share his joy with. That single, 2-minute question transformed our relationship. He began referring other small business owners to Apex, always telling them, "Ask for Cora. She actually listens." Then there were the Martino sisters, Elena and Lucia, who ran Whispering Hills Vineyard, a stunning estate in the sun-drenched valleys east of the city. They were approaching their winery's 10th anniversary. I found a small article about them in a local magazine and sent them a handwritten card congratulating them on the milestone, mentioning how much I admired their commitment to sustainable farming. Lucia called me, not to discuss their account, but to thank me. She ended up telling me the story of how they'd used their inheritance to buy the land and the struggles and triumphs of the last decade. The next month, they expanded their service package with Apex, a move that brought in an additional $80,000 in annual revenue. These weren't calculated moves. They were the simple, human gestures I'd learned at my father's hardware store. I was treating our clients like neighbors. I remembered that Beatrice Rowe, the fiercely intelligent owner of Oakhaven Press, had a passion for first edition poetry, and I would occasionally send her links to online auctions. I learned that the manager of a tech startup we serviced was training for the Port Blossom Marathon, and I'd ask about his long runs. Miranda, however, saw none of the value. She would stalk past my desk, her gaze lingering on my screen, a frown tightening her lips. My call times were longer than the department average, and my interaction logs were filled with what she deemed unprofessional personal chatter. "Cora, we need to discuss your performance," she said one afternoon, summoning me into her glass-walled office. The bay, usually a brilliant blue, was a moody gray that day, mirroring my own feelings. She held up a printout of my metrics, the red ink circling my call durations like a warning. 45 minutes to resolve a simple software patch query? What could you possibly have been discussing for that long? I was talking to Elena Martino, I explained calmly. She was telling me about a pest issue they're having with the vines, which led to a conversation about their expansion plans. They're now considering our strategic growth package. Miranda was unmoved. Your job is to patch the software, not consult on viticulture. You are creating inefficiencies in the system. Your sentiment scores may be high, but your productivity is lagging. She didn't understand. She saw a spreadsheet, but I saw a web of trust being woven, thread by delicate thread. Our client retention rate had climbed by nearly 40% since I'd started, an unprecedented jump. But because the reason couldn't be quantified in her preferred way, it didn't exist. She couldn't draw a straight line from asked about daughter's art school to increased revenue, so in her mind, the connection was a mere coincidence. The breaking point arrived on a cool, drizzly Tuesday in October. Our CEO, Mr. Julian Reed, a distinguished man with silver hair and a thoughtful demeanor, was leading our annual departmental review. When he got to the client relations slide, he paused. "I want to commend this department," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "Our client retention is at an all-time high. Churn is down, and our top-tier accounts have increased their spending by an average of 15%. Whatever we're doing here, it's working. Let's make sure we understand it and replicate it." I felt a quiet warmth spread through my chest. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope. Perhaps now, the value of connection would be recognized. I chanced a glance at Miranda. Her expression was a mask of polite interest, but I saw a flicker of something else in her eyes, a cold, sharp fury. She had been championing an automated, low-touch client interaction model for the past year. This data, this success, was a direct contradiction of her entire philosophy. And she knew exactly where it was coming from. Later that day, she cornered me by the coffee machine. Her voice was low and tight, a coiled spring of anger. "I don't know what little game you think you're playing, Cora, but it ends now. This company was built on professionalism, not on being a pen pal to every lonely shopkeeper in the city." Her punishment was disguised as a project. She tasked me with conducting a comprehensive audit of all my client interactions for the past 18 months. I was to document every call, every email, every personal touch, and correlate it with a quantifiable business outcome. It was a monumental, punitive task designed to bury me in paperwork and pull me away from the very work she despised. She was demanding that I prove the unprovable, to fit the beautiful, messy, human reality of my work into her sterile boxes and spreadsheets. She thought it would break me. But as I began, something shifted. I saw it not as a punishment, but as an opportunity. A chance to create a testament to my work, to my philosophy, to the lessons from Havenwood. For the next 3 weeks, I poured my soul into what I started calling the Tapestry Project. It was more than a report. It was a story. I meticulously documented every conversation, but I also wrote the narrative around it. I showed how the call with Mr. Laurent about his daughter's art school led to 3 new client referrals. I detailed how the anniversary card to the Martino sisters directly preceded their $80,000 contract expansion. I wove together the threads of casual chats about books and marathons and family with the hard data of renewed contracts and increased investment. The final document was over 70 pages long, a rich and detailed tapestry proving, undeniably, that connection was not a distraction from business, it was the business. It represented nearly $250,000 in revenue that could be directly traced back to these inefficient conversations. I submitted it to Miranda with a sense of quiet pride. It was my heart and my work, bound in a simple blue folder. It was proof. I believed, naively, that even she could not argue with the numbers when they were laid out so plainly. I was wrong. A week later, she called a mandatory all-hands meeting for the entire department. The mood was tense. Miranda stood at the front of the conference room, the large monitor behind her blink. We're here today to discuss our client relations strategy and the importance of maintaining professional standards, she began, her voice ringing with authority. Cora has recently completed a comprehensive audit of her work, and I thought it would be an instructive case study for us all. My heart, which had been fluttering with nervous anticipation, suddenly felt like a stone in my chest. This wasn't going to be a validation. This was going to be an execution. She had me pull up the tapestry project on the main screen. Then, for 20 agonizing minutes, she systematically tore it apart. She scrolled through my notes, reading my words aloud with a tone of derision. Followed up with Mr. Laurent regarding his daughter's university acceptance. Unprofessional, she said, her red laser pointer circling the sentence. This is a breach of professional boundaries. We are not their friends. We are their service providers. Sent a card to Whispering Hills Vineyard for their 10th anniversary. Inefficient use of company time and resources. Our contracts are based on service-level agreements, not sentiment. My face burned with humiliation. My colleagues stared at their notebooks, at the floor, anywhere but at me. I could feel their discomfort, their sympathy, but they were silent, trapped in the same culture of fear that Miranda had so carefully cultivated. She was taking the most meaningful work of my career, the very essence of my professional beliefs, and holding it up as a spectacle of failure. Then came the final, brutal act. She navigated to the folder on the shared drive where the master file of my 70-page tapestry was saved, along with all my source documents and relationship notes. This entire methodology is flawed. It is a drain on our resources and a liability to our professional reputation, she announced to the silent room. Her hand was steady on the mouse. Effective today, we are returning to a strict, metrics-driven protocol. All client communication will be logged through the standardized system. All personal notes will be purged. This approach, she said, her voice dripping with disdain as she gestured to my work on the screen, is garbage. And then she pressed delete. I watched the file icon vanish. 70 pages of my heart, my effort, my proof, gone. The screen behind her was once again blank. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum where my work had once been. Miranda turned to face the department, a look of triumphant finality on her face. She had erased the evidence, reasserted her authority, and humiliated me in the process. In that moment, something inside me didn't break, it clarified. The hurt was sharp and deep, like a shard of glass in my soul. But beneath it was a sudden, cold calm. I had given my best to this place, and they had not just rejected it, they had desecrated it. My phone, resting on the table in front of me, vibrated silently. Lost in the haze of shock, I barely registered it. Miranda was already launching into her new, rigid protocols, her voice a relentless drone. I felt a desperate need for air, for space away from the suffocating judgment in that room. I quietly pushed my chair back and slipped out into the hallway, my hands trembling. I looked down at my phone. The missed call was from a number I didn't recognize, but the voicemail notification was already there. I pressed play, holding the phone to my ear. The voice was warm, measured, and kind. Hello, Cora. My name is Leo Serrano. I'm a partner at Kindred Advisory. I know this is out of the blue, but we've been following your work for some time through the wonderful things your clients have to say about you. We believe that what you're doing is the future of this industry. We heard there was a departmental meeting today at Apex. I imagine you might be considering your options. If you are, we'd like to talk. Urgently. Kindred Advisory. I knew the name. They were a smaller, newer firm, but they were making waves. Their entire business model was built on what they called holistic partnership, a philosophy that sounded remarkably like the lessons I'd learned at Hayes Hardware. My hands were still shaking, but now it was for a different reason. I stepped into an empty stairwell, the concrete walls cool and grounding. I called the number back. The conversation that followed felt less like a job interview and more like a rescue. Leo didn't ask about metrics or KPIs. He asked about my philosophy. He told me about Mr. Laurent, who had sung my praises at a local business association meeting. He mentioned that Lucia Martino had spoken glowingly about me to a friend who happened to be one of their founding partners. They hadn't just been watching Apex's retention numbers, they had been listening to the stories behind them. "We don't just think your approach has value, Cora," Leo said, his voice earnest. "We believe it's invaluable. We want to build our firm around it. We're prepared to offer you a position as Director of Client Engagement. The starting salary would be $300,000, plus a substantial signing bonus and a clear path to partnership." I leaned against the cool concrete wall, the numbers barely registering. It was the validation that took my breath away. Director of Client Engagement. A role created for me, based on the very work that had just been publicly declared garbage. "We know you have non-compete clauses," he continued, anticipating my next thought. "We would never ask you to violate them. We don't want you to bring a client list. But we know that genuine relationships are not proprietary data. They belong to the people who build them. If you come to work with us and your former clients happen to find their own way to a firm that shares their values, well, that's just the natural course of things, isn't it?" I understood. He was offering me not just a job, but a lifeboat. And in his words, I heard the echo of my father's wisdom. People don't come back for the hammers. They come back because they care. I ended the call and stood in the quiet of the stairwell for a long moment, the world tilting on its axis. I took a deep breath, tasting the city air, a mix of salt and rain. I walked back to the conference room and opened the door. Miranda was still talking, pointing to a new flowchart on the screen. The energy in the room was leaden. She stopped when she saw me, an impatient look on her face. "Cora, do you have something to add?" I walked to my seat, gathered my notebook and my phone, and stood up straight. I looked not at Miranda, but at the faces of my colleagues, and then briefly at Mr. Reed, who was watching me with a curious, unreadable expression. "Yes, actually," I said, my voice quiet but clear, carrying across the silent room. "I do. I resign," I said. "My resignation from Apex Solutions Group is effective immediately." A collective intake of breath swept through the room. It was the only sound. Miranda's face, which had been set in a mask of smug authority, slackened into disbelief. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. "You can't be serious," she finally stammered, color rising in her cheeks. "You can't just resign in the middle of a meeting. There are protocols. A 2-week notice period. I believe my employment contract has a clause regarding constructive dismissal in a hostile work environment," I replied, my voice remaining level. The calm I felt was a strange and powerful shield. Publicly berating an employee and destroying their work in front of the entire department would certainly qualify. "I don't think human resources will dispute it." Mr. Reed, the CEO, finally spoke, his smooth baritone cutting through the tension. "Cora, perhaps we should step into my office and discuss this. Let's not make any rash decisions." I met his gaze. There was a flicker of what looked like genuine concern there, but it was too late. The damage wasn't just in the deleted file, it was in the trust that had been shattered beyond repair. "Thank you, Mr. Reed, but my decision is made," I said politely. "I've already accepted a position elsewhere." I turned my gaze back to Miranda, whose expression had morphed from shock to incandescent fury. It seems some companies still believe that building relationships is a worthwhile endeavor. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the conference room. I didn't run. I walked with a deliberation I hadn't felt in years, my back straight, my head held high. I could feel 22 pairs of eyes on my back, and I knew that in that moment, I wasn't just walking away from a job, I was walking toward myself. My new life began the following Monday. The offices of Kindred Advisory were nothing like the cold, imposing tower of Apex. They were located in a beautifully restored brick building in a historic part of Port Blossom, with large windows that let in the soft coastal light. The air smelled of fresh coffee and old wood, and the atmosphere was one of quiet, collaborative energy. Instead of sterile cubicles, there were open-plan work areas interspersed with cozy nooks for conversation. It felt less like a corporation and more like a community. It felt, in a way, like home. Leo and the other partners welcomed me not as an employee, but as a peer. They gave me a beautiful office with a view of the bay and a simple directive: do what you do best. Build us a culture of connection. I didn't poach a single client. I didn't have to. I simply updated my professional networking profile with my new title and location: Cora Hayes, Director of Client Engagement at Kindred Advisory. The first call came on Wednesday. It was Mr. Laurent from the Gilded Crust. "Cora, I saw you'd moved on," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "I hope you'll forgive me for tracking you down, but things just haven't been the same. I called Apex with a question yesterday, and the fellow I spoke to, well, he was efficient, I'll give him that. But he didn't know me from Adam. Tell me, this new place of yours, do they have room for a small bakery?" By the end of the week, I had spoken to the Martino sisters from Whispering Hills Vineyard. "We heard you left," Lucia said, her voice laced with concern. "Miranda Croft called us." It was a very different kind of conversation. She wanted to talk about optimizing our service package. We tried to tell her about our new plans for an event space, and she told us to submit a ticket through the client portal. There was a pause. "Anyway, we're not happy. Tell us about Kindred Advisory." One by one, they reached out. Beatrice Rowe from Oakhaven Press, the marathon running tech manager. The small, family-run businesses and the burgeoning startups that I had taken the time to know. They weren't just accounts, they were people I had built real trust with. They were choosing to follow not an employee, but a relationship. Meanwhile, a quiet storm was breaking at Apex. I heard whispers through the professional grapevine. A former colleague, a kind woman named Clara from the analytics team, met me for coffee a few weeks later. She looked stressed, her shoulders hunched. "It's chaos, Cora," she said, stirring her latte distractedly. "Miranda is in a complete panic. She can't understand why all our top-performing accounts are suddenly at risk. She's convinced you're stealing them, that you've violated your contract. She's having IT scour your old emails for proof." "They won't find any," I said softly. "I know," Clara sighed. "But she can't see it. She keeps sending out these cold, corporate emails, assuring clients of Apex's unwavering commitment to excellence. She even tried to replicate your methods, but it comes across as so fake. She sent Mr. Laurent a generic email about supporting local arts. He told her his daughter was already enrolled and doing wonderfully, and that perhaps she should have paid attention sooner." Listening to Clara, I didn't feel a thrill of revenge. I felt a profound sadness. Miranda was trapped in her own rigid worldview, unable to see the truth even as her department crumbled around her. She had mistaken the map for the territory. She thought the client data in her system was the relationship, and when she deleted my map, the tapestry project, she couldn't understand why the territory itself was walking away. She had deleted the only thing proving the connections existed, but she hadn't deleted the connections themselves. They lived in the hearts and minds of the clients. Within 2 months, Kindred Advisory had on board a dozen former Apex clients, representing over 40% of Apex's annual consulting revenue. My signing bonus, which I had used to pay off the last of my student loans and send my parents on a long overdue vacation, felt like a symbol of this new, healthier reality. I wasn't just earning a living, I was being valued for the very thing that made me who I was. The climax of this quiet unraveling came 3 months after my departure. My phone rang, and the caller ID showed a name I never expected to see again: Julian Reed. His voice was different this time, less of the smooth CEO and more of a man on the brink. He was gracious, but there was an undercurrent of desperation. He talked about strategic restructuring and market shifts. He told me that Apex was struggling, that the board was deeply concerned. Then he got to the point. "We made a mistake, Cora," he said, the admission sounding like it was costing him dearly. Miranda Croft's leadership has been reevaluated. Her employment with Apex has been terminated. I felt a pang, not of triumph, but of weary finality. "We want you to come back," he said, the words rushing out now. "As Vice President of Client Relations. You can name your price. You'll have full autonomy, your own team. You can build the department in your image. The Tapestry project, we want you to build it for the whole company." The irony was staggering. The very work declared garbage was now the company's only hope for salvation. The position I was being offered was a direct repudiation of everything Miranda had stood for. For a fleeting second, I pictured it, returning to that glass tower, a conquering hero. Vindicated. But the image felt hollow. Why would I return to a place that only learned to value me through loss? A place where my worth had to be proven by their failure? "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Reed," I said, and my voice was gentle. "I truly do. But I've found my professional home." Kindred Advisory didn't need a crisis to understand the value of connection. They believed in it from the start. "That's not something I can walk away from." He was silent for a long moment. "I understand," he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "I wish you all the best, Cora. You've certainly earned it." 6 months later, Apex Solutions Group, unable to stop the bleeding, was acquired by a larger, more impersonal national conglomerate. The name vanished, the sleek tower got a new logo, and most of the staff I knew were laid off in the merger. It wasn't a dramatic collapse, but a slow, quiet fade into irrelevance. Today, I am a partner at Kindred Advisory. Our firm is thriving, built on a foundation of authentic relationships. I spend my days doing the work I love, with people who see my deep-seated belief in human connection not as a weakness or an inefficiency, but as our greatest strength. Sometimes, when the afternoon sun hits my office just right, I look out at the ships moving across Port Blossoms Bay, and I think about Miranda. I don't feel anger anymore, just a kind of sorrow. She was so blinded by her own rigid beliefs that she couldn't see the value right in front of her. She thought she was deleting a file, but she was really deleting the invisible threads of loyalty that held her world together.